It came about because he wanted to make a horror movie. He had investigated other genres, science fiction and so on. And now it was time to make a horror movie. So he read different things, and it came down to my novel, The Shadow Knows, and Stephen King's The Shadow Knows, yes, and Stephen King's book, The Shining. And so he chose, for various reasons, the King, but in the process of having talked to me and Stephen King, probably decided I was more docile, or,
A mistake on his part.
In the scores of articles and videos I've consumed that analyze The Shining, a subject I haven't seen tackled is the context in which it was created. In addition to the obvious influences by Stephen King, Diane Johnson, and Stanley Kubrick, the biggest underlying influence was the era of the 1970s, and more specifically 1970s America. But we'll return to that a little later. Kubrick preferred to adapt existing works for his films because he could critique them fairly. In other words, he loved the initial experience of a finished story that he could not get from creating his own, which could roll around for ages in one's mind, especially his. Anyway, I think he chose Stephen King's book because he genuinely enjoyed it, especially the way it led the reader to think the ghosts were merely psychological, before pulling the rug out to reveal they were actually there all along.
Great party, isn't it?
And he wanted to use the book's plot as a way to explore many more ideas and themes. In an early note, for example, Kubrick sort of chastises King for not realizing murder backwards does not look like this, but rather like this, which led to a whole running theme of inversion. The second reason Kubrick chose King's book was that he wanted to exploit a new filming method that he fell head over heels for, the Steadicam, because he was nothing if not a technophile.
What would you like for Christmas, Stanley?
A fortune computer.
Why do you want a fortune?
Because it has the best chip architecture and the most advanced operating system.
What's that?
It's called Unix.
And 3, Kubrick, as a genre-hopping director, wanted to try his hand at a straight-up horror film, and saw the inevitability of box office success after the financially disappointing, though critically acclaimed, Barry Lyndon. King's name, a pre-existing audience based on the book, and the past decade's string of blockbuster horror films all but guaranteed a hit. Kubrick definitely sought box office success, if for no other reason than it would make funding his next film easier.
One of the things he wanted to be sure is that Warner Brothers get their money back.
One thing he adamantly did not want, however, was Stephen King's help. Kubrick didn't even look at a screenplay King wrote, and instead looked for other authors, whom he regarded more highly than screenwriters, to write with him. He was an admirer of Diane Johnson after reading her first-person novel, The Shadow Knows, but after learning she was teaching a course on Gothic novels at UC Davis, had already been a professor there for a decade, and having diverse and deep phone conversations, hired her. In addition to having written several novels herself, Johnson was a critic for the New York Review of Books, so she was able to look critically at King's book, along with Kubrick, pull out its skeleton, and add richer, juicier flesh to its bones. The Shadow Knows, the title of which derives from the old radio series,
Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow Knows.
Details the paranoia and claustrophobia of a divorced woman as she deals with a possible stalker while living with her kids in Sacramento.
Dad?
Much like The Shining, it deals with a parent finding married with kids life uncertain and exasperating. The main character, just called the letter N, is a sort of mix of Jack and Wendy Torrance. She's slowly going crazy from cabin fever, as she's now living in a small apartment with 3 children and barely ever leaves, and also fears, fueled by a constant stream of crime in the news, that her ex-husband and a host of tertiary characters could be the stalker she thinks is trying to kill her. Kubrick was impressed with her ability to, quote, create dread and fear, and considered adapting her book into a movie, but ultimately decided it wouldn't work because of its first-person nature, and that, quote, better movies are often made from lesser literary works. In fact, the two of them have been surprisingly critical of King's work over the years, and if you're watching this, you probably know how King feels about Kubrick's adaptation of his book, and his, in my opinion, unfair criticism of it, though he might feel defensive because
Jack Torrance was as autobiographical as I've ever come to a character. Jack Torrance in the movie seems crazy from the jump.
if King doesn't think Jack has an arc, maybe it's because book Jack's first thought. In fact, the literal first sentence of the book is him thinking about the hotel manager, officious little prick, which comes off as a man already filled with frustration and anger, just like movie Jack.
Shelley Duvall as Wendy is really one of the most misogynistic characters ever put on film. She's basically just there to scream and be stupid.
And while movie Wendy does start out weaker than book Wendy, she comes on strong at the end, and ultimately has the biggest arc in the story. Johnson and Kubrick also diverged from King in this important aspect, the overanalyzing and reductive way they thought he wrote. I can't blame King for being offended by Kubrick totally ignoring his script, the condescending criticism over the years, the, as he would see it, mistreatment of his characters, and the possible insult of having Book Jack's red beetle crushed under a truck while movie Jack drives a yellow one. So I think his disparaging comments about the movie are more out of defensiveness than justified criticism. But the biggest under-the-radar influence on all three of these writers was America of the 1970s. The US had come a long way from the optimism of JFK in the early 60s. Johnson and King began their writing careers during the most divisive war in a century and continued through the biggest political scandal in American history. Violence and paranoia seeped into literature and other media of the time for good reason. Fear and anxiety caused by an ever-increasing crime rate, serial killers, cults, terrorism, energy crises, social upheaval via political groups like the Black Panthers and the American Indian movement, breakdown of the nuclear family.
The American family as we know it, it's not working. It hasn't worked, and it'll work even less in the future.
And the aforementioned Vietnam War and Watergate scandal created an uncertain, pessimistic, and disillusioned population.
It is a crisis of confidence.
Additionally, the serial killer Ted Bundy is surprisingly similar to movie Jack, as Bundy was called a mix of showbiz and violence.
Here's Johnny!
So this was the environment in which King, Kubrick, and Johnson created The Shining. To use a cliche, it captured the zeitgeist of 70s America. But how could all this have affected Kubrick so much, as he had lived in England since the early 60s and rarely left due to his fear of flying, which, ironically, he would probably say justifiably came after he earned his pilot's license? Well, you should know that he never stopped feeling American. He stuck to an American work schedule and even had his sister living in New York tape Yankees and New York Football Giants games to send him. He would have preferred to live and work in New York City, where he grew up, but it didn't have the filmmaking infrastructure that London had, and he also wasn't willing to live in what he called phony Hollywood. Another example of this paranoia and claustrophobia in contemporary cinema, especially when related to the nuclear family, can be seen in David Lynch's first feature film Eraserhead. It was Kubrick's favorite movie at the time. He screened it for his cast and crew to, quote, put them in the mood. In other words, to emphasize the oppressive, fearful nature he was seeking for his film. More similarities include the protagonist, who, like Jack, feels estranged from his family, and after killing, or trying to kill his child, reaches some sort of afterlife at the end. In fact, when we see the happy partygoers purposely dated July 4th, 1921, I believe Kubrick is contrasting these two American eras, the optimism of the roaring 20s against the pessimism of the stagflating 70s. I'm going to save even more thoughts on this matter for my next and probably last Shining video, hopefully dropping near the end of the year, where I'll delve into the truly inordinate theories concerning subliminal meanings and messages. I fully believe in some but can't fathom others. Stay tuned.